I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
2 consecutive presidents are forced from office. One undone by the quagmire he created in Vietnam. The other brought down by his own illegal acts. It was a time of turmoil, a time when the republic itself seemed threatened. Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for re-election, and Richard Nixon's resignation from the most powerful office in the world on this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. By early 1968, the war in Vietnam had come to dominate life and especially politics in the United States. Relentlessly, endlessly, Americans were transfixed by scenes of war on millions of television sets night after night. It divided generations, it fueled mass protests, and it ruled political dialogue in America. One man, Lyndon Baines Johnson, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, had come to personify the whole American effort in Vietnam. By January of 1968, the United States had more than 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam, the majority sent there by President Johnson. And as the number of troops on the ground grew, so did the intensity of the anti-war protests at home.
Hey, hey, LBJ! How many kids you killed today?
And despite the billions poured into his Great Society program designed to erase poverty in America, President Johnson's dream of ending the turmoil of civil rights had gone up in the smoke of Harlem, Watts, and in the long hot summer of 1967 in Newark and Detroit.
He knew, President Johnson knew, that his great achievement in history was going to be the Great Society. And this war was like a fungus on the face of the Great Society. It infected it, and in time it almost destroyed it as it collapsed his own presidency.
For Americans, the frightful news from Vietnam was inescapable.
Con Thien has become a focal point for more than a year of heavy fighting along the DMZ, a lightning rod for North Vietnamese artillery across the border, and the closest the Vietnam War has come to being conventional. A Marine who was there in the month of September had a 50-50 chance of being hit. There were 600 casualties among the 1,200 men who were on it.
As the casualties mounted, the discontent at home began to mushroom. In the fall of 1967, President Johnson called a meeting of what he called the wise men, former government officials and military leaders, some of whom were the architects of his Vietnam policy. They advised him to be more forceful in pounding home one message to the American people: we are winning.
I've never been more encouraged during my entire almost 4 years in country. I think we're making real progress. Everybody is very optimistic that I know of.
But the massive communist offensive known as Tet that began on January 30th, 1968, shattered whatever illusion of progress there was in Vietnam. For more than 2 weeks, the Viet Cong blasted away at more than 40 cities and towns in South Vietnam in a savage, sustained attack. Some of the fiercest fighting was in Hue, the old imperial capital, south of the demilitarized zone.
We're in an observation point overlooking a house some mile and a quarter across the hills there, where it is believed 120 VC are holed up and perhaps a large supply of ammunition. And Major Booth here is calling down artillery fire from some 10 miles back there on that target.
Vietnamese Rangers and Marines moved carefully, blasting buildings and possible Viet Cong hiding places before moving ahead. This was the first time heavy fighting has taken place in Saigon proper.
In the end, the South Vietnamese, with massive American help, prevailed.
Their will did not, as expected, break under the fire. neither shall ours break under frustration.
But Tet came as an enormous psychological shock to many Americans. Maybe, just maybe, victory was not as close as the administration had been saying. Walter Cronkite summed up those doubts in an unusual editorial.
To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
Watching the evening news that night, Johnson reportedly turned to an aide and said, "If I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people."
The communists had suffered a disaster, a debacle, and a serious military loss. But it was a psychological victory for them in the United States that they could not win from our men on the battlefield. I have never seen some of our stalwarts in our operation in Washington dealing with the Southeast Asia theater that were as depressed as they were after Tet.
It was during some moments in late 1967 and early 1968, I think, I sent the president a quote from de Tocqueville. The quote goes like this: "The people grow tired of a confusion whose end is not in sight." I sent that to the president and I said, "Mr. President, this is what you're having to confront right now. Because not only do the people not see a light at the end of the tunnel, they can't even find the tunnel."
So Johnson dispatched General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to South Vietnam to evaluate the situation on the ground following Tet. And Wheeler came back with the same advice the Pentagon had been giving since the war began.
And General Wheeler asked that we study, that we consider a program over a year's time that would, if approved, result in a substantial increase of our presence in Vietnam at that time. And that ran over 200,000, 205,000 plus, 304, I think, or something.
By this time, Johnson was beginning to think about a change of direction in Vietnam. He asked Clark Clifford, his new Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk to help.
When I received the plan, General Wheeler, that said this is the way we look at it, I said, as I indicated at breakfast, I wish you to develop by Monday morning, March the 4th, this February 28th, recommendations in response to the situation presented to us by General Wheeler and his preliminary proposal. I wish alternatives examined.
The President is at the center of new, vigorous debate within his administration over how many more troops to send to South Vietnam. General William Westmoreland wants an additional 200,000 men. He has been wanting them since last summer. President Johnson is undecided. His spokesman emphasized that he does not yet have a formal request from General Westmoreland, but he knows what the general wants.
After this directive of February the 28th, I believe, Secretary Rusk came in and said, well, now, in the light of all that I have observed, I think the time has now come to stop the bombing above the 20th parallel.
What was your reaction when Secretary...
To get on your horses and get it back to me as quick as you can with your recommendation.
An unconditional bombing halt was a stunning recommendation from Rusk, one of the chief advocates of the air war in the North. Remarkably, Lyndon Johnson had frequently said he had doubts about being president. In fact, as early as 1964, he said he had decided not to seek another term as president. A letter from his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, changed his mind.
He said, "Beloved," and I knew the way she started off that she didn't agree with me. "To step out now would be wrong for your country, and I can see nothing but a lonely wasteland for your future. Your friends would be frozen in embarrassed silence, and your enemies would be jeering. I am not afraid of time, or lies, or defeat. In the final analysis, I can't carry any of the burdens that you have talked of. So I know it's only your choice. But I know you're as brave as any of the 35 presidents. I love you always, Bird."
So Johnson ran in 1964, and he won by a landslide. But 4 years later, it was a different story. The war had overwhelmed the man, his mandate, and his sweeping domestic agenda. Maybe he could revive his plans for the country, he thought, if he announced he was not running for re-election. But he had a problem.
There were a good many good arguments made that it would be inconsistent to achieving what we wanted to achieve for me to go up and say to the Congress that I recommend that you do all of these things, and then concluded by saying, "But I'm quitting. I'm throwing in the towel, and you go on and do this by yourself."
The war was dominating all. The war had stymied the president's domestic agenda. He faced an unprecedented revolt from within his own party in the person of a then obscure senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy.
So we are volunteers for Senator Eugene McCarthy, who is running to give the people of Concord an alternative to President Johnson.
Hi, how are you?
McCarthy had been campaigning hard as an anti-war candidate in the first-in-the-nation Democratic primary in New Hampshire.
This is the Democratic bastion in New Hampshire, where the hawkish sentiment runs the highest. Yet this is the very place Senator Eugene McCarthy must make his inroads against Lyndon Johnson, if indeed he is to make them.
A minute ago, you said that your campaign was coming along all right. That's not a very strong description of it.
Well, I don't know. I think that's an honest statement of it. We haven't despaired. We haven't begun to fold up our equipment and leave the room. So we're still on the positive side. We're still moving.
The low-keyed Minnesota Democrat entered the race against his party's incumbent president for the express purpose of giving the voters a voice in the Vietnam debate. And the volume with which New Hampshire's voters today endorsed his effort signals trouble for President Johnson's as yet undeclared re-election bid.
I didn't expect him to get the votes that he got there, although he didn't get a majority of the votes. The president's name wasn't on the ticket, but it did surprise me that even against the stand-ins that he would get that vote.
McCarthy's showing in New Hampshire demonstrated that public support for the administration's Vietnam policy was collapsing. That primary caused a political earthquake. In March, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, brother of the slain president, announced that he was running for the Democratic nomination.
I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war.
In public, at least, the president seemed determined to continue the war.
Unless we have some sign that he will not accelerate his aggression if we halt the bombing, then we shall continue to give our American men the protection America ought to give them, and that is the best America affords.
But inside the White House, it was a different story. The president's advisors watched in dismay as his popularity ratings plummeted. By the end of March, only 36% of the American people approved of his performance as president, and only a dismal 26% approved of his handling of the war. All eyes were now focused on the upcoming Wisconsin primary.
Good afternoon, Jansen headquarters.
If Lyndon Johnson is the underdog in the Wisconsin primary, you certainly don't see any sign of it here in his campaign headquarters in Milwaukee. There's none of the frantic activity that you would expect with the primary just a week away. Here, the appearance at least, is all low-key. The most effective campaigner is Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who hits the major issues head-on. Yet, in a recent appearance in Milwaukee, only some 350 persons turned out.
President Johnson has had a difficult course to follow, and he's held to that difficult course in Vietnam. A course avoiding both appeasement and the risk of World War III, and it's been no pleasure ride, and some people have helped give him a few bumps. Now, there are those who say we must have peace in Vietnam. My fellow Americans, who more could want peace than the President of the United States?
Late in March 1968, while the Vietnam situation was still under official review, a group of unofficial advisors assembled at the President's request, the Elder Wise Men, as they were called by Washington insiders.
The notes made on this meeting with the unofficial Wise Men group indicated that Secretary Atchison felt that we should make a visible sign that there is an effort being made to establish something different, which is probably the institution of peace talks, which I do not think would get very far, says Mr. Atchison, but would be an entering wedge to perhaps bring about some kind of cessation or differentiation of our effort.
Which dovetailed perfectly, Johnson thought, with Secretary of State Rusk's proposal for an unconditional bombing halt. The President asked for time from the three networks to speak to the nation.
Tonight, I have ordered our aircraft, I'd back up there, back up again. I wouldn't say we're going to, back up.
The President will address the nation tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. He hopes to make it a Roosevelt-style fireside chat about the war. He will discuss new troop deployments, rising military costs, and Vietnam strategy, possibly including a bombing pause.
He had called in Horace Busby, who had been writing speeches for him since the mid-1940s, and had Busby do two endings, one in which he was going to seek renomination and an ending that he delivered. I don't even think Busby knew which one he was going to use. It was so typical LBJ of holding his cards close to his vest, even at a trembling and sensitive moment like that one.
I ask your support, my fellow citizens, for this effort to reach across the battlefield toward an early peace. May God be with us. Good night.
It was the late afternoon of March the 31st that I decided on the route and the time and the content of the announcement I made on March the 31st.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
My colleague Roger Mudd has been in the CBS studios here in Washington with me. Roger, no question about it, this was a bombshell politically.
It's what I'd rather do, Dan, is go home and come back tomorrow morning and begin to talk about it.
I wanted to use the announcement that had to come as a predicate and as a basis for getting all the steam I could toward a possible successful peace move.
He thought the country was being terribly polarized by the war and by the insistence of a lot of young people that, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The incessant drumbeat of those murderous words on a president bound to have some impress.
What were your own expectations for the bombing halt? I mean, what did you really think was going to result?
I hoped for a great deal more than has been achieved. I was desperately trying to show that I was reasonable, that our country would prefer to talk rather than fight. After all, the president was taking himself out of politics. He wasn't going to be a candidate. He was going as far as he felt he could go without endangering his troops in the field. And they should bring some kind of response. And I think North Vietnam thought so too, and they did, for the moment, agree to come to the table.
On March 31st, 1968, the bombing halt went into effect over North Vietnam, except in the area near the demilitarized zone. 6 weeks later, delegates from Hanoi and Washington began meeting for preliminary talks in Paris. And 6 months after that, on October 31st, the president extended the bombing halt to all of North Vietnam as another step in mutual de-escalation and as an incentive to negotiations that remained in stalemate long after the end of the Johnson administration.
Vietnam would continue to haunt LBJ's successor, Richard Nixon, but Nixon was much more aggressive in dealing with his domestic critics and in dealing with them. He set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to his downfall. July 24th, 1974, a pivotal day in the two-year-old drama known as Watergate, the investigation into the burglary of Democratic National Headquarters in Washington and the cover-up that followed. The break-in had been the work of Nixon loyalists, a secret task force called the Plumbers, formed by the White House to plug news leaks, particularly about the Vietnam War. From the time the men were arrested, White House Watergate strategy had one goal: insulate the president from any connection to the break-in and cover-up. But that strategy was unraveling. The Supreme Court was about to rule on whether President Richard Nixon had to turn over 64 audio tapes of White House conversations previously withheld from the Watergate investigators.
Good evening. On the day that a committee of the House of Representatives, for only the second time in our history, began debating whether to recommend impeachment of a president of the United States, back in this building, 8 justices of the United States Supreme Court handed down a critical decision for that same president.
In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 that President Nixon must turn over 64 subpoenaed White House tapes.
But perhaps the most significant event was taking place in a small room in the White House. White House counsel J. Fred Bizart was listening for the first time to one of those 64 tapes. It was a conversation between President Nixon and his then Chief of Staff, H.R. Bob Haldeman, back on June the 23rd, 1972. Just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. As he listened to the tape, Bizart heard President Nixon tell Haldeman to get the CIA to order the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation on grounds of national security. Bizart, a veteran lawyer, realized the president's instructions were a crime, obstruction of justice. The fight to save Richard Nixon's presidency, Bizart realized, was over.
As we mentioned earlier, the House Judiciary Committee, for the first time in more than 100 years, for the second time in our country's history, began meeting this evening to debate articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. We go now to Bruce Morton at the Capitol.
Little groups of committee members worked all day drafting proposed articles of impeachment, and a new draft aimed at winning the broadest support possible was introduced this evening by 73-year-old Harold Donahue, the committee's second-ranking Democrat. There are just 2 articles. The first charges the president with obstruction of justice over the Watergate investigation. It lists 9 specifics: condoning false statements, trying to misuse the CIA, approving and concealing the payment of money for silence. Those are some examples. The second of these broad articles charges abuse of office through things like illegal surveillance and the creation of the Plumbers Unit. There are 8 specific counts there, including the president's refusal to honor the committee's subpoenas. But tonight's debate was not on specifics. It was general. In fact, it was not a debate at all, more a set series of opening speeches. Chairman Peter Rodino took the philosophical road when he opened this evening's session.
We have reached the moment when we are ready to debate resolutions. Whether or not the Committee on the Judiciary should recommend that the House of Representatives adopt articles calling for the impeachment of Richard M. Nixon. Make no mistake about it. This is a turning point, whatever we decide. For more than 2 years, there have been serious allegations by people of good faith and sound intelligence that the President, Richard M. Nixon, has committed grave and systematic violations of the Constitution.
I wonder what the prosecutor in the United States Senate is going to do for witnesses. I wonder what he's going to do. Is he going to plead his whole case on tapes because he can't use any of the witnesses we had? Because every one of them testified no act of wrongdoing on the part of the President? Is there a soul here who honestly believes that 67 out of 100 senators are willing to accept this kind of evidence? I don't think so.
Today I am an inquisitor, and hyperbole would not be fictional and would not overstate the solemnness that I feel right now. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution.
And if the young people in this country think that we're going to not handle this thing fairly, if we're not going to really try to get to the truth, you're going to see the most frustrated people, the most turned off people, the most disillusioned people, and it's going to make the period of LBJ in 1968, 1967, it's going to make it look tame. So I hope that we just keep our eye on trying to get to the truth.
For 3 days, the committee debated the resolution. Then, the historic vote.
The question now occurs on Article 1 of the Donahue Resolution as amended by the Sarbanes substitute as amended. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no.
That I demand.
Call of the roll is demanded, and the clerk will call the roll. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no.
Mr. Donahue.
Aye.
Mr. Brooks.
Aye.
Mr. Kastenmeier.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Hungate.
Aye.
Mr. Conyers.
Aye.
Mr. Eilberg.
Aye.
Mr. Walde.
Aye.
Mr. Flowers.
Aye.
Mr. Mann.
Aye.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Aye.
Mr. Seiberling.
Aye.
Mr. Danielson.
Aye.
Mr. Drinan.
Aye.
Mr. Rangel.
Aye.
Miss Jordan.
Aye.
Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
Miss Holtzman.
Aye.
Mr. Owens.
Aye.
Mr. Mezvinsky.
Aye.
Mr. Hutchinson.
No.
Mr. McClory.
No. No.
Mr. Smith.
No.
Mr. Sandman.
No.
Mr. Railsback.
Aye.
Mr. Wiggins.
No.
Mr. Dennis.
No.
Mr. Fish.
Aye.
Mr. Maine.
No.
Mr. Hogan.
Aye.
Mr. Butler.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Lott.
No.
Mr. Fraley.
Aye.
Mr. Moorhead.
No.
Mr. Marazzini.
No.
Mr. Latta.
No.
Mr. Rodino.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk will report.
27 members have voted aye. 11 members have voted no.
And pursuant to the resolution, Article 1, that resolution is adopted and will be reported to the House.
The President met this afternoon with his Chief Defense Attorney, James St. Clair, and with Fred Bizart, the attorney in charge of the tapes. No word on what was discussed. Deputy News Secretary Gerald Warren re-emphasized during the day that the President has no intention of considering resignation, even should the full House vote impeachment. Warren said that the President had not authorized any lobbying on his behalf in the House and was not even keeping a head count about possible votes, because, Warren said, the President is certain that the House, after it considers all of the evidence, will not vote impeachment.
As the House Judiciary Committee finished work on 2 more articles of impeachment, White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig finally read a transcript of that damaging June 23, 1972 tape. Until then, Haig had not been convinced the battle was lost. But after reading the transcript, Haig immediately saw that the fight to save the President was finished. Monday, August 5, 1974, the White House releases the transcript of the June 23rd conversation. It explodes like a grenade.
Good evening. The Nixon presidency is virtually being overtaken by events tonight. One of Mr. Nixon's Senate leaders, Griffin of Michigan, and his chief House Judiciary Committee defender, Wiggins of California, both asked for his resignation. The president himself admitted he has lost his impeachment fight in the House, that he has not always given the public the straight story on Watergate, and that he withheld from his lawyers and the House committee certain damaging information. Dan Rather reports.
The President made public 3 transcripts of meetings with his former chief aide, H.R. Bob Haldeman, all June 23, 1972. This was 6 days after the Watergate break-in, 3 days after an earlier discussion of Watergate with Haldeman, the tape of which has been mysteriously erased, and 1 week before John Mitchell was dismissed as presidential campaign manager. This is the first time that contents of these June 23, 1972 tape recordings have been made known outside of the White House. With the new transcripts, the President issued a written statement of his own. In it, he acknowledges that what the transcripts say is, as Mr. Nixon puts it, at variance with what he told the American people on other occasions. In this regard, the President acknowledges that he has known this since last May. Thus, he acknowledges that he has known for 3 months what his own lawyers, his defenders in Congress, and the American people didn't know. Mr. Nixon apologizes for this, expresses deep regret that it happened, says he did not intend for it to happen. Whether this new revised presidential statement becomes the so-called smoking pistol, proving clear-cut guilt, or merely, as the President put it today, a potential problem, Mr. Nixon, in effect, leaves to the United States Senate to decide. For in his new statement, the President concedes that he will be impeached, probably by the House of Representatives, and tried by the Senate.
And I just blew my stack. I said to my colleagues, this is all I'm going to take. I'm going up and talk to the President. I didn't know what the hell I'd talk about, but I was going to go up and talk to him. Mm-hmm. The President was on a needle, and we had to be very careful, because he'd fall one way or the other off that needle, and if he fell in favor of the Congress trying him, we could be in a bad fix in this country for government for maybe 6, 7, or 8 months.
While the impeachment proceedings went on.
That's right. So we sat there in the Oval Room, and the President acted like he just played golf and just had a hole-in-one. You'd never think this guy's tail was in a crack. So finally he said to me, Barry, what do you think my chances are in the Senate? Well, I said, you might get 10 votes. He said, let me think about it. So we left, and the press was outside, and went out and talked to them and said what we thought we could say, which wasn't too much.
There's been no decision made. We made no suggestions. We were merely there to offer what we see as a condition on both floors.
I called Ben Bradley and I called his boss.
Kay Graham?
Yeah. I said, now I know there's a hell of a story cooking up here, but you do the country a big favor if you don't print it.
I guess Goldwater thought that if we hammered him too hard, he'd say, to hell with it, I'm going to stay here. Let him, I'll bring down the country with me.
Hold it. Barry Goldwater comes out of that house across the street, calls his old pal Ben Bradley and says, Ben, he's going to resign, but don't print this, because if you print it, he won't resign.
From my point of view, he was saying, I think he is going to go, and I think he's going to go if you guys don't hammer him apart in the next 24 hours.
And you wanted to see him go, therefore you decided to hold your fire.
I decided that I would listen to my friend, and whose wisdom in these matters exceeded mine.
Good evening. President Nixon reportedly will announce his resignation tonight, and Vice President Ford will become the nation's 38th president tomorrow. That word comes unofficially from aides and associates of both men, but not from the two men themselves. And the swiftly moving events of this busy day in Washington tend to confirm it.
Last night at a family dinner upstairs in the White House, some of the family was in tears. The president was not. Presidential speechwriters worked through the night preparing a possible resignation address. The president himself worked on it early this morning. In late morning, Vice President Ford was summoned to the president's Oval Office. The meeting began at 11 a.m. Washington time. In an hour and 10 minutes, it was over. At 12:20 this afternoon, Presidential News Secretary Ronald Ziegler stepped before microphones and an overflow crowd of reporters in the White House briefing room.
I'm aware of the intense interest of the American people and of you in this room concerning developments today and over the last few days. This has, of course, has been a difficult time. The President of the United States will meet various members of the bipartisan leadership of Congress here at the White House early this evening. Tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, the President of the United States will address the nation on radio and television from his Oval Office.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
This is a scene, Walter, that Richard Nixon, by my own fast count this morning, has done at least 150 times during the 2,000-plus days of his presidency. This will be the last time that he will do it as President of the United States.
Thank you.
You are here to say goodbye to us, and we don't have a good word for it in English. The best is au revoir. We'll see you again. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint. Now, however, we look to the future. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
And there's the president coming up. Here he is on the South Lawn already.
They are emerging from the so-called diplomatic entrance downstairs.
There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford. Phil Jones is on the South Lawn there. Phil?
Just before the Nixons appeared here at the South Portico, his personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, came out with tears in her eyes. Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, fighting back tears. The president's personal physician moved out ahead to get some pictures of Mr. Nixon as he leaves the White House here to board the helicopter for the flight to California. Vice President Ford this morning, as he left his home to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
There are some of the waves goodbye to President Nixon.
And President Dan is getting his last look now as he peers back from that seat in the helicopter
What a scene
of the
there,
White
Walter.
House as President of the United States.
The premature end of the presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon appear to have little in common, but in fact, they shared a national trauma, Vietnam, that came to dominate America's political dialogue. Vietnam turned into a living nightmare for Lyndon Johnson, and it was Vietnam, in the form of the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the secret study of that war, that drove Richard Nixon to form the White House plumbers to stop future leaks. It was the plumbers who broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex, the act that ultimately led to his downfall. It was a moment when the very foundations of the Republic were shaken. But President Gerald Ford, in his eloquent acceptance speech, spoke a simple truth. The Constitution works, he said. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.